Welcome back to Dr. Akmal Mukhtiam's YouTube channel, and today we're going to be discussing grief, but we're going to be looking at some stages. Dr. Akmal, what would you like to discuss today?
We discussed the pre preparation of grief in view of COVID 19, that we needed to confront it because it is now staring us in the eye everywhere. The moment we go out or the moment we are in touch with our surrounding. And of course, being interdependent, we are constantly at risk of that. The other bit is that because grief is now happening all the way, all the time, and over 800 people are dying in England every day, and many other people are dying in Pakistan as well, and the rest of the world, and in some countries of Europe, very high numbers, and in the US, almost 2,000 averaging every day. So, grief is something that is extremely frontal as far as we are concerned. So, what happens in grief and COVID is that traditionally there is the shock of somebody's death. This shock is compounded because the deceased has been taken away. You're not around. You haven't been able to look after that person. You haven't been able to see that person. And you are actually yearning to find out something about that person. And then there is absolutely no news except very small pieces of information because the person has been quarantined, literally quarantined, emotionally quarantined, and physically quarantined, as is the case. Now, when this happens, there is this guilt and extreme distress, and the shock is compounded because you are told the person is stable or in critical condition, is has pneumonia, has fever, and because of all the literature that is available to you, you know that it is a matter of time before the person either survives or doesn't. So once somebody is already on a respirator, the chances of survival are rather dim. So, although many people have survived, but that in itself, so, when people think, oh, we need to have lots of respirators, respirators themselves are a dangerous stuff. And so, I would say that if you are confronted, God forbid, that it may not happen to anybody, but if it does happen to somebody, then this is a very complicated grief. The shock is a shock with a tremendous degree of helplessness. There is helplessness in death in itself, but this is actual compounded helplessness where you have just seen that loved one being taken away.
Yep, and also the deterioration is quite rapid. One minute they're fine, the next minute they're in ICU. Now, before we move on to the other stage that we wanted to discuss in the video, what would you advise those who are in this situation where they are, where they unfortunately have lost a loved one and they are in this shock stage of grief? So,
Okay.
what are the ways to cope and
The thing is that I do not consider grief as a pathological illness that needs treatment. Grief is as natural, and death is more natural than anything else because if you're born, you have to die.
it's the only guarantee in life?
That's the only guarantee in life. So the thing is that there is nothing that one should be able to suggest to people that you've lost somebody most beloved to you or extreme loved one, and that somehow the shock has to be subdued or subsumed into something, or you should be diverted into something, or you should get a tranquilizer, or you should get distraction. That is absolutely pathological in itself.
Right.
So it is actually denying yourself of life because death is as much part of life as life itself.
Okay.
So I would say that when somebody has that stage of shock or feeling of shock, when the person is absolutely baffled by it, totally helpless by it, and doesn't want to confront this particular reality,
Mm.
but has to confront that reality because it is real.
Mm.
There is nothing that one should do.
Okay.
So, what I would say is that there needs to be an acceptance, an embracing of it. And I think that usual patronizing dialogues, you will get patience and God will forgive you or forgive the loved one and all that. These are extremely, I would say, insensitive sentiments. They are so impersonal. They don't really matter.
Okay.
So I would feel that what should be done is to embrace that person, to be with that person. You don't really have to fill a void through your words, which that person's life has just experienced. How can you, with your superficial words, create fulfill that void, that vacuum?
Okay, but now you said be there for that person. If we're in isolation, how would you recommend that if people are not able to go and, like you mentioned in the previous video, the traditional routes are not there?
No. And so that is why in the last one, what I suggest was, so okay, we can look at two scenarios here. One scenario is where there are 2, 3, 4 members of the family. So you are dealing with grief as a familial unit, as we said, interpersonal rather than intrapersonal. And I recommended that somebody in the household would bring people together and begin to talk about the potential of grief and bereavement that it may happen. Now, in terms of if somebody's totally isolated, so you hear you're by yourself, you're quarantined, and you hear that a loved one has passed away. Now, that's an extremely painful scenario. Now, but that does not mean, because in England, we have the ability to take a necessary outing with all the precautions. Public transport is still going on. Many shops are open, although with all the social distancing. There is no harm in going to the grave later on if somebody's been buried. If you have been allowed to go and join the funeral, there's no harm in doing that. Rather, I would suggest that you must, because that is how you deal with it. That is how it is quantifiably in front of you. And that is not, various stories of magnification in your own brain being created or what could have happened and so on and so forth. So I would say that that's what you need to do in terms of dealing with shock, that you need to go and address it, see it, and maybe there is technology available. You can have a video chat with the loved one.
Yeah.
You can, but if God forbid you don't have anybody, then of course there are the services available. Samaritans are there. Grief counselors are there. Your GP may be able to tell you how to deal with that. Okay. So I would suggest that that's how you should try to deal with the shock.
Right. And is there a point where the shock could go on too long?
The shock can go on too long, and there is a possibility that in this artificial and the pandemic scenario, it could go on too long.
Right.
But the more you try to address that by confronting this fact, by going to the grave, by discussing the circumstances of death, by discussing details of death, by reading more about it, and then of course you will then come to the further stages that you need to deal with.
Okay, great. So now the second stage you wanted to discuss in today's video, what was that one?
Now, what happens is that after shock, there is the denial. And denial is that the mind doesn't want to believe that has happened.
Right.
The cognitions and your brain knows that it has happened. The emotions don't want to. And this denial is actually a yearning and a refusal to accept. So in this denial, one goes into this phase that it hasn't happened, may not have happened. Was it a mistake? Could something have gone wrong? Could something be done? Or could, so on. So there are lots of other feelings that come in. And that's where the denial is the predominant feature. Now, when I say shock and denial, it isn't that shock has to have 3 days and denial will have 4.5 days. It isn't like that.
I was going to ask, do they?
Yeah. So these all could be merged in one. And what it could be that in the first instance where there is acute grief and wailing and part acceptance, but primary shock is there. What's happened? It shouldn't have happened. No, it probably didn't happen, and then you come to this denial bit. No, it didn't happen, but yes, it happened. So you understand what
So
I'm
the
saying?
inability to, like, so for example, when we've gone through our own loss, it's happened, but you cannot digest it. What is that?
No, that is a typical preservation of yourself. Your loved one is a part of you. Who is this loved one? Your parents are 50%, your gene. Your father's 50%, your mother's 50%. And emotionally, there could be far more. Your personality could be, predominantly what your household has brought you. So when somebody dies, that genetic heritage, that emotional heritage, that genetic makeup, and that emotional makeup of your own existence, physically you see that person dying, there is the desire to preserve that in one's own self.
Right.
So when you retain somebody in you and you don't want, you're shocked by their physical loss and you deny their physical loss, what it means is that you want to retain that part of you which constituted you.
Right. So how would we, or the people around someone, I mean, because obviously if there is someone who's died, unfortunately, then obviously we're stuck in isolation. The other people in the households will have had the same loss. The relationship might be different, but
They're going on,
yeah. So what would we say are the techniques, or should we even not even have a technique?
No. I mean, I don't think there are techniques, but here what human interaction and human support comes into play.
Okay.
You start talking about the person whose loss that you experienced. You start discussing that person, discussing the circumstances, make the whole thing tangible. And the more you talk about that person, the more you preserve that person emotionally and to an extent physically. And the more you deal with addressing
The
by
reality.
visiting the grave or visiting whatever the memorial, that is where you preserve yourself.
Okay. So now, when someone is going through that loss, we're talking about other people coming in to support them virtually, however it is according to the guidelines and regulations at the moment. But sometimes you don't want to because people are not helping you. It's not making you feel better. What is that all about?
Okay, well, there are
Or
two
are
things
they
here.
making it better, but you're just not?
No, I think that this is a cultural attitude. People with Eastern culture are receptive to receiving people because that is part of their historical makeup.
Right.
That is part of their historical heritage. People in the West who are generally individualized, everything has to have a particular purpose.
Yeah.
For them, these visits are not of so much value, except from the probably very close ones. But what I would say is that part of the Eastern culture is that you have ritualized mourning, and that ritualized mourning is the way to deal with it. So the shock and denial, the first two phases, may be dealt with by mutual talk, discussion, memorial, remembering, praying for the deceased, visiting the resting place of the deceased, and so on. So the more you get involved in that process of that person's death,
Mm.
the more you are in touch with what is going on with yourself.
Wonderful. We have actually run out of time. Thank you so much for discussing this, and we will be making more videos on grief. Do tune in, and also in the description, we will be giving websites and details for organizations that can help you with loss and grief. And finally, if you'd like the video, please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you so much.